I think that my perspective, as I had said last time, is very much that of a man who has personally gone through the process of trying to execute projects in a particular industry as a member of the private sector in India and specifically in Mumbai over the last 5 years. So, my perspective really focuses on the deep challenges that we face as members of the private sector, whether it's in real estate or in industry, or in any kind of industry, because of the way I believe. Sorry, I'll just wait. Because of the way that I believe CRZ norms, RRZ norms, and EIA norms are currently drafted, written, and implemented. So, I unfortunately am not going to be presenting a conservative or incremental approach to the issues. I fundamentally believe that a radical solution, a radical overhaul of CRZ norms is a necessity. And I think that it's time that we acknowledge that necessity. And I'd like to back that statement up with a little bit of perspective. So, I've come to the conclusion as a young person, I'm only 24, and having moved back to the country only in 2010, I read a very famous quote once, and it said, "Justice must not only be done, but also appear to be done." Now, unfortunately, in India, we seem to be going in a very different direction, where the only thing that is important to us and our friends in the media is that justice must appear to be done. Whether justice is actually being done or not is entirely irrelevant to the nation. So long as the media and the rest of society believes that the private sector is being scrutinized, whether it's from the perspective of coastal zone or from the perspective of environmental application, we're satisfied that the necessary environmental protection has been achieved. And I think it's high time we realize that simply forming committees and requiring NOCs to be obtained does not automatically lead to the protection of the environment or to sustainable development. We need to enter into what that procedure actually consists of. We need to understand what kind of NOCs we're receiving and whether the process as it currently exists is either protecting the environment or allowing for sustainable development to occur. Because the way it currently operates, we neither protect the environment, and I'm going to be so bold as to say we neither protect the environment nor allow sustainable development to occur. So we lose at both ends. Now, in my opinion, and I'd like to focus specifically on CRZ, these regulations have no substantive basis. They do not have sufficient scientific, technical evaluation done prior to these kinds of regulations being formed and implemented. In fact, from the perspective of our urban centers, and again from the perspective of Mumbai especially, there is sufficient evidence to show that CRZ's impact on the development of Mumbai has been a matter of coincidence rather than a matter of legislative or regulatory intent. And I repeat, a matter of coincidence rather than a matter of regulatory or legislative intent. And I will expand on that in a minute. Prior to that, I'd like to take you all through what I believe the objective of any government should be from the perspective of environmental regulation and development. I think that the objective should be to create a framework which protects the environment and allows for efficient and sustainable development. That should be the aim of the government. We need to ensure together, in partnership with our friends in government, that we do not slip back into the days of license Raj, which, let me tell all of you all today, as a member of the private sector, there is a clear feeling in the private sector that the last few years have seen us slip gradually but steadily into the era of license Raj that we've all experienced. I mean, I haven't personally experienced, thankfully, but I think that most citizens of India remember that era very clearly. Now, for this, I believe that a final acknowledgement is required that development is not perpetually and perennially at cross purposes with environmental protection. They are not mutually exclusive objectives. Development can very much occur even with the environment being protected, so long as certain mitigating, compensatory steps are taken. this is not that as difficult to do as I think most of us imagine it is. So I think typically when people are in a position to enunciate their views on an issue like this, they typically suggest fairly incremental policy changes within the existing framework because it's relatively uncontroversial. But I think that the point of me being here today is to be a little bit controversial. And so I will make a bold statement and say that a complete overhaul of CRZ and EIA for cities in particular is required. For cities in particular. Now, why is this? I think that history has taught us one lesson very clearly. Water being water, both riverine coasts as well as a sea or ocean coast is an area of dense human habitation for one reason or another. Whether it's the availability of water or the availability of livelihood through fishing and the various other sources that an ocean can provide, coastal areas have always been an area of dense human habitation. I think that that's one thing that we all need to get clear, that it's not like human beings do not live on the coast. So for any part of the coast to be declared on the basis of any reason whatsoever a no development zone, I think is fundamentally at cross purposes with the human experience. A clear distinction also needs to be drawn within the coast between existing urban metropolises and virgin coastal areas. I think that both of these need to be treated completely independent of each other. They're two completely different situations. The priorities of governance in both of these categories of land area and land use are completely different. And therefore, in established cities which have existed prior to, for example, the promulgation of CRZ itself, and we have many examples in India. Again, I will refer us back to Mumbai because I think it's the most glaring example of an important coastal city, one of the drivers of the Indian economy, which I think we're losing our way a little bit in terms of the way we administer this city. Now, in cities, development needs to be prioritized. And I repeat, development needs to be prioritized with two caveats. Not development in a haphazard way or development without any kind of limits or restraints whatsoever. The two caveats that I add are this. Development must happen in a sustainable manner. Now, this word I think is used very often on any conference to do with the environment, but I think I mean something very specific by sustainable. I mean, what I mean by sustainable is things like the construction techniques used, technology used, waste management implemented. These things, international standards of green building norms, for example, these need to be implemented along the coast and frankly anywhere in the country. But development needs to be prioritized. Now the second and equally important aspect, apart from the actual process of construction which minimizes the impact on the environment, is also something to compensate for or to mitigate for the environmental impact of an entire region. So I think that, as I've already said, and what I've tried to do as a way forward is try and come up with only the beginnings of a framework that we can use to begin this overhaul, to begin this reframing of CRZ. I think that the first thing that India needs to do is identify important urban centers. Identify important urban centers which act as three things: wealth creation hotspots, employment generation hubs, and centers of dense urban population. That is the role that a city plays within the development of a nation and of an economy. Once we acknowledge that these are three important roles that a city plays, we get to the next stage, where we reformulate both CRZ and EIA for cities totally. We start from scratch with the following steps. I think that step one, and as an ardent nationalist and a patriotic Indian, I am not averse to looking towards the West for global best practices. Let me make that amply clear. So I believe that a rapid research project needs to be undertaken by international consultants, bringing in global best practices on the needs of Indian cities, on the following parameters. First, urban housing and commercial property design. Start from scratch, from the design perspective onwards. Are they being designed with materials that are energy efficient? Are they being designed with materials that even during the process of construction have minimal environmental impact? So you start with that. So the actual urban housing and commercial property planning and design perspective. Second, urban infrastructure requirements and design in terms of roads, highways, metros, subways. What are the needs of Indian cities? How best can these infrastructure needs be met with minimal impact on the environment? Again, I repeat, an international consultant's report on this is necessary. Third, for Indian cities, and for each individual city this shall have to be taken up, what density of vertical development versus horizontal expansion should the city be going through? Which one is better for the needs of that city? Is it better for the surrounding environs? Is it better for the environment in the outlying areas of the city that we have the kind of urban sprawl that we've seen in Delhi, or the kind of vertical expansion that we see, for example, in New York or to a certain extent in Mumbai? This is an important cost-benefit study that needs to be undertaken. And finally, a study on the impact of the forecasted development of a city along the coast and on any other environmental factors, including pollution. Lastly, suggestions for the mitigation or compensation techniques to be undertaken in outlying areas around the metropolitan region. This will essentially provide us with a framework that allows us to prioritize development within the boundaries of an established metropolitan region while creating compensatory activities in the outlying areas. The idea behind this is simple. Yes, we know that there is an impact, there is a carbon footprint, there is environmental degradation wherever dense human population occurs. Nobody denies that. The question is, considering the needs of that city, considering the needs of the millions of human beings who call that city their home, how best can we compensate our environment for this by way of other mitigational steps? So the new policy, I believe, that should be based on this sort of a comprehensive report would implement the following ideas. I think established and well-planned urban centers need to focus on the establishment of a high quality of urban life as a priority. What do I mean by a high quality of urban life? I'm talking about air pollution, I'm talking about water pollution, I'm talking about noise pollution, I'm talking about the kind of quality of life that any individual in any city should be able to expect, which, by the way, Indian cities don't currently allow us to do. Second, the new policy, the new framework must insist, and I repeat, insist, on construction materials and technology being at par with international green building norms. And let me emphasize, being from the industry, the cost of implementing international green building norms is insignificant to us by comparison to the delays that the current bureaucratic system imposes upon us. There is absolutely no comparison between the two. Now, and I think that this is the most radical part of my idea for a new framework, I think that an important question is going to be who implements and at whose cost these apparent compensatory and mitigatory factors and steps that I want to take outside of a city. For which, an idea which I would like to move is any area of the private sector that is involved in development within a city is expected to pay a specific identified separate charge, duty, tax, cess, whatever we'd like to call it, the proceeds of which are all utilized towards the planting of new trees, the protection of the virgin coasts, the creation of new marine ecosystems, or whatever it is that the relevant people think is important. What this does is solves two problems at the same time. Once again, the cost of an additional charge or cess or duty on any industry is not going to be prohibitive. It's not going to make industry any harder to do. And at the same time, we have a clear source of funding for the compensation that the environment requires. I think I'm almost done. I think that the end of this study, and I think that the eventual implementation side of a new CRZ framework would consist of local town and country planning norms coming up with a development plan. And that development plan being viewed in cognizance with the environmental impact of the region's forecasted development and compensatory steps being introduced accordingly. Just before I end, I'd like to just show to everyone, and in fact, I believe that one of the speakers in a previous section already referred to this piece of land, so I'd like to show everyone this piece of land. it's just an example, I think, that will serve to really emphasize the farcical nature of CRZ regulations as they are currently being implemented for places like Mumbai. Sova Beach. If I just zoom in here a little bit more, and a little bit more. Okay, so what you see here is dense urban development, residential buildings in all four directions around what appears to be a vacant plot. So there's development to the north, south, east, west. And you've got this vacant plot right in the middle of everything. Now this doesn't happen in a city typically. The reason this has happened is a tributary of a creek happens to end at the northwest tip of this plot. But it ends, mind you, it doesn't continue. At that point, local corporation, the government, has built a nala with a retaining wall, which is the northern boundary of this plot. In the monsoon, the creek water overflows from that nala onto this piece of land and has allowed mangroves to survive. 3 kilometers away from the coast, inland mangroves, so 3 kilometers away from the coast, inland mangroves have caused this entire plot to remain undeveloped. Are these the kind of mangroves that we're trying to protect? Are these mangroves contributing to the protection of our coasts? Are these mangroves protecting the marine ecosystems? No. These mangroves exist simply for the sake of existence, and our current norms, which apparently protect the environment, prevent that plot from being developed in the middle of Mumbai city. This is the way CRZ is being implemented currently for cities. Now, before I end, I think that it's important that I expand on a statement that I made right in the beginning. I said that there's sufficient evidence to show, there is sufficient evidence to show that CRZ for Mumbai, the way it is currently implemented, is a matter of coincidence, of chance, rather than any kind of legislative intent. And I'd like to prove that. Many of the people in this room probably already know this, but a few may not. And I did mention this in Mumbai as well. I don't think that many of us realize that the source of Mumbai's so-called problems with CRZ are completely coincidental. In the year 1967, and please bear with me, it's going to be a very, very quick history lesson. In the year 1967, Mumbai received its first development control regulations, an independent, dedicated body of norms only concerned with the development of Mumbai. By the time the mid-1980s rolled around, I think that there was an acknowledgement in the state government that a fresh, updated set of development control regulations was required. Are we all with me till there? A fresh development control regulation was required. And therefore, the drafting of said regulation started in 1987, 1988. In the year 1989, the suggestion-objection period was completed and a draft development control regulation of 1989 was submitted to the state government. In the year 1989, a full 2 years prior to the creation of the coastal regulation zone in our country. For one reason or another, that development control regulation remained in draft form up until the 21st of February 1991. It's a very important date for all of us living in Mumbai and on the coast, which I've lived all my life. On the 21st of February 1991, Mumbai received an updated development control regulation, which essentially made obsolete the development control norms of 1967, which were 40 years old, which are 50 years old by now. Unfortunately for, I think, hundreds of thousands of residents of Mumbai, and I think for the city in general, sheerly by coincidence, 48 hours prior to the new development control regulations being signed into force, 48 hours prior to it only, the CRZ regulation dated 19th February 1991 was gazetted and came into force. But even at that point, we didn't realize what had just happened to the future development of our city. Because on 19th February 1991, I think it's safe to say that MOEF was a relatively less well-followed ministry than it is today. I think today, if a single piece of paper moves in the MOEF, every single media house in the country is going to be there. I think on 19th February 1991, no one knew what was going on at MOEF in New Delhi. So we have this situation, and this CRZ regulation comes into force. One clause within that CRZ regulation stated that for CRZ2, which all existing built-up areas come within that category, that classification of CRZ, existing town and country planning norms shall continue to apply. I repeat, all the notification said was existing town and country planning norms shall continue to apply. Unfortunately for us, in the year 1998 and then thereafter in 2006 by way of opinions, and finally in 2007 by way of a Supreme Court judgment, a position was established, and this is really, really crucial. Thank you. A position was established that the word existing in that original document of 19 Feb 1991 ought to be interpreted as existing on the date that the notification was brought into force, i.e. 19 February 1991. Which single piece of gross misinterpretation by various individuals within the government and the Supreme Court created a situation where Mumbai was forced to contend with a situation in which two independent pieces of development control regulations were being implemented in the same city. The result of this was that for the entire 500-meter belt, which is a significant chunk of Mumbai's landmass, we were forced, and continue to be forced, by the way, to implement projects, development, under rules that have existed in the year 1967 with no changes after the date 19 Feb 1991. Which meant that a draft regulation that was completed, finalized in all respects by the year 1989, has not been implemented in significant parts of the city for the last 15 years. And we continue to operate in a situation where there's a 500-meter line in our city, and if you happen to live on one side of it, you happen to fall within the purview of your local town and country planning norms and regulations. And if you happen to fall on the wrong side of it, it doesn't matter what your local representatives do. It doesn't matter what your local legislative body does. It doesn't matter what your local corporation does, because the rules that will be implemented for you will be the rules that we thought up in the year 1967. It is a farce. It is the degradation of the city in the guise of environmental protection. It's the retardation of development in the guise of coastal protection. And I think it's time that we make a change. Thank you.